Today, I'll be looking at a book that straddles the line between magical realism and fantasy, so let me slap on both names for this one. The movie's title is Neverwhere, a popular book by Neil Gaiman that came recommended by patron NCJ. I told you guys we'd have time to cover the author. About the author. Neil Gaiman was born in 1960, the son of a Jewish family who lived in the south of England. His parents became Scientologists after his birth, but Neil himself would grow up to be agnostic. As a child, Gaiman was an avid reader, consuming classic fantasy works, Batman comics, and even his assigned school books. Gaiman knew he wanted to be an author straight out of high school, and so in the early 80s he became a literary journalist, in the hopes that he'd make the connections he'd need to get himself published. It apparently worked, because while he quit journalism in 1987 after becoming disgusted by lax standards, he would also write a few non-fiction books, and write for independent comic books thanks to his friendship with Alan Moore. Soon after he quit journalism, DC Comics hired Neil Gaiman to write the limited series Black Orchid. That got him the attention of DC's new head of the mature Vertigo division, Karen Berger, and she asked him to reimagine the old DC superhero Sandman. And that's exactly what Gaiman did. He replaced the superhero with a godlike entity better known as Dream, and the series would end up having much less to do with heroism and much more to do with mythology and famous literary figures. The Sandman would run for 7 years, from 1989 to 1996. That wouldn't be Gaiman's only output, however. He also wrote for several other DC comic lines, and in 1990 he collaborated with the perhaps more famous Terry Pratchett on a book called Good Omens, about a demon and an angel teaming up to stop the apocalypse because they're rather fond of the current state of existence. In 1996, he was the screenwriter for Neverwhere, but buckle in, because the story about this story has a few layers to it. Neil Gaiman co-created Neverwhere along with Sir Lensworth Harry, although he wouldn't be knighted for another 20 years or so. BBC Two picked up the story and turned it into a 6-episode miniseries, and Gaiman did most of the script writing shortly before or during the production. Simultaneously, he wrote a novel version, and incidentally, this was the first proper novel he ever wrote as a solo author. Also, the novel takes full advantage of its unlimited effects and set design budgets, and includes every scene and every action that had to be cut from the miniseries. Thanks to the simultaneous writing, Neverwhere the novel came out the same year as the miniseries, 1996. The book would turn out to be a bigger hit than the TV series, in part because the novel would get a wide release to an international market, while the series didn't. Plus it had some production issues that aren't very relevant here. What is relevant is that Gaiman's international publisher asked him for a new version for the second release because the original copy assumes that the reader already knows London's layout. So Gaiman rewrote the book, and while he was at it, he decided to expand and deepen the story. Then, in 2006, Gaiman created a third version that combined both previous editions, along with a few more scenes. This is the definitive edition, at least according to the author, and it's the version that I'm reviewing today. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at the story. The book begins by introducing a bunch of things all at once. Richard Mayhew is from Scotland, but 3 years ago he moved to London to work at a securities firm. A nameless young woman has been running for 4 days. A couple of supernaturally powerful thugs named Mr. Krupp and Mr. Vandemar are on a trail, and they hired a guy named Ross to take the lead. The narrative then settles on Richard's point of view, describing how he got used to living in London and even got himself a fiancée, Jessica. Jessica is a woman with big ambitions, and while she's been controlling Richard's life, Richard is laid back enough that he doesn't really mind. Meanwhile, Krupp and Vandemar catch up to the nameless woman, but she uses her strange power to open doors to open Ross's chest and kill him. She then gets wounded, but she then uses her power one last time to escape. Richard and the woman's stories intersect, as Richard and Jessica are walking to an important dinner at a restaurant. Richard notices that the woman is very injured and tries to help her, but Jessica gives him an ultimatum: ignore the girl and go to dinner, or the wedding is off. Richard, despite being a pushover, picks the girl up and walks off, and brings her to his apartment when she insists that she doesn't need a doctor. When the girl comes to, she's disoriented until she realizes that she's in something she calls London Above. As she's dressing her wounds, Krupp and Vandemar come around asking about her, but Richard can tell they're suspicious and tells them nothing. They still barge in and search the place, but the girl manages to hide from them. Afterwards, the girl says that her name is Dor, and not short for Doreen, and a rat shows up to pass her a message. The message is from the Marquis de Carabas, and as one last favor, Dor asks Richard to meet the Marquis and ask him to help in exchange for a big favor. Richard does so, and after the Marquis leaves something with a roof walker named Old Bailey, he goes to Richard's apartment, and he and Dor leave for something called the Floating Market. At first, that seems to be the end of it for Richard, but after he relaxes over the weekend, he heads into his job on Monday and discovers that nobody knows he works there, and they don't even notice him unless he bumps into them. The ATM refuses to give him cash, and even Jessica seems only vaguely aware that he exists. Then he heads home and discovers his landlord is about to let out his apartment. Richard doesn't understand what's going on, but he realizes that Dor must have something to do with it. He puts some clothes in a sports bag and heads out. The first person to actually see him is a homeless man. Richard asks him about Dor and the floating market, so the man brings him to a secret underground hole where the Lord Ratspeaker reigns. The Lord Ratspeaker puts a shiv to Richard's throat, but before we find out what happens next, we get an aside with Krupp and Vandemar. Their employer tells them that the other one won't work out, and so the two must now capture Dor and not kill her. Back with Richard, the rat from earlier steps in to vouch for him, despite Richard's disrespect to Ratkind. So, the Ratspeakers take most of Richard's stuff, but they also send him off to the floating market with a girl named Anesthesia to guide him. We now see what Dor's been up to. She and the Marquis have returned to her home, a place which only her family should be able to reach because of their special ability to open any door. However, Krupp and Vandemar got in and killed her whole family, and this is her first time back since that happened. The two go to her father's study, and as the Marquis pockets a few things, she finds her father's journal and an entry that tells her to find the angel Islington if something happens to him. As for Richard, he and Anesthesia cross a strange underground bridge, Knight's Bridge, and while Anesthesia is taken by the nightmares that inhabit it, a woman with a strange accent and caramel skin keeps Richard safe. The floating market turns out to be at Harrods, a famous London department store, although the market also changes locations every night. Richard is here to find Dor, and Dor is here to hire a bodyguard who could stand a chance against Krupp and Vandemar. Dor's family is famous, so all the toughs of London below line up and fight each other to prove their skill to her. The last man standing is Varney, whom Krupp and Vandemar have threatened into being their mole. But then, the woman with caramel skin shows up and reveals that she is Hunter, the best fighter in possibly the whole world. Hunter bests Varney and takes the job. Meanwhile, Richard meets up with Dor, and she, mostly out of pity, lets him tag along. The party's next stop is Earl's Court, which turns out to be on a secret car on London's subway system. The Marquis has to leave because of bad blood between him and the Earl, but that's okay because he has business elsewhere. They learn from the Earl that there's an easy way and a hard way to reach the angel Islington, but the easy way can only be traversed once. This way is the Angelus, a fancy old door kept at the British Museum, and the Earl drops them off there. Hunter has to stay behind when Dor and Richard head up to London Above, but just after they surface, Krupp and Vandemar show up and taunt them about how there's a traitor in their midst. Strangely, they let the two get away, and so Richard and Dor enter the museum and crash a party being held by Jessica. Jessica gradually realizes that Richard exists, but he and Dor manage to enter the Angelus even with security coming after them. Richard and Dor meet with Islington, and the angel promises that he can explain who hired the two assassins that killed Dor's family and restore Richard's life in London Above. All he needs is a special key being kept by the Black Friars. Meanwhile, the Marquis has stopped by Old Bailey for information, and then he goes directly to Krupp and Vandemar. The Marquis trades an old vase in exchange for 3 questions and an hour's head start. However, the 3 questions don't reveal much, and the 2 assassins violate the head start and kill him anyway. Richard and Dorr return to London Below, and Hunter takes them to a place controlled by the 7 Sisters so they can rest in peace. The 7 Sisters are normally dangerous, but Hunter is an old lover of one of them. They then go to the Black Friars, and because the Friars have 3 tests and the group has 3 people, Richard is forced to take the 3rd and deadliest test the Friars have. It's a room that makes you feel like worthless garbage, that makes Richard think that he's become a homeless bum, and he's hallucinated the past few days. Fortunately, he snaps out of it and retrieves the key. The group then heads to the new floating market location, so they can find someone to guide them to the hard way to Islington. Meanwhile, the sewer people have found and stripped the Marquis's body, and rats have informed Old Bailey of his death. But this is all according to the Marquis's backup plan. So Old Bailey buys his body from the sewer dwellers at the floating market and resurrects him using the thing in the box that the Marquis gave him. It works, and the Marquis comes back to life, but he doesn't get back to the market before Richard finds what is clearly some sort of vampire named Lamia and convinces the others to let her guide them to Islington via Down Street, which, in London Below, goes straight down. Lamia separates Richard from the others during the descent, and then she starts stealing his heat. But luckily, the Marquis shows up just in time to make her stop. However, he doesn't show up in time to stop the betrayal. Hunter was also working with Krupp and Vandemar, and they bribed her with a special beast-killing spear. They still need Dorr alive, though, so they take her and the Blackfriars key deeper into the labyrinth beneath Down Street. It's at about this point that the Marquis explains that he died so that he could find out that Islington is the one behind everything. He's a fallen angel banished to London Below by God because he let Atlantis die. But with the key and Dorr's special ability, he'll be able to return to heaven. Richard and the Marquis enter the labyrinth, and they let Hunter come along because all she wants to do now is kill the Beast of London, an ancient and massive boar that wanders through the maze. The group encounters the beast and it mortally wounds Hunter, but she accepts her fate as justice for her betrayal. As such, she makes herself a distraction so that Richard can deal the final blow. And for this feat, Richard apparently gains the title of warrior. Still, Richard and the Marquis are no match for Krupp and Vandemar, and so they get knocked out and manacled to the wall when they reach Islington. Islington lets them live, but only so that he can torture them, to get Dorr to open the way to heaven. Dorr soon agrees, but when she opens the door, it's not heaven on the other side, it's the corona of a distant star. Islington and the 2 assassins get sucked through, and afterwards Dorr explains that she made a copy of the key at the floating market, and just opened a door to the farthest location she could think of. Afterwards, the Blackfriars find Dorr, Richard, and the Marquis, and they explain that the key isn't a key to heaven, it's a key to reality. Dorr can use it to restore Richard's existence in London above, and he asks her to do so. There are a few bumps thanks to Richard's short disappearance, but everything smooths out quickly enough. Richard doesn't get back together with Jessica because he's changed since then, but he's got a good job, good friends, and some other potential girlfriends. But after a few weeks of that, Richard realizes that a normal life isn't good enough for him anymore. And so, he heads back down to London Below. The analysis. Having read both this book and American Gods, I can't help but think of Neverwhere as a rough draft for the later novel. A protagonist discovers that there's a supernatural world that overlaps the world he thought he knew, he's coerced into participating in the supernatural world, and he eventually realizes that the people he trusted are the bad guys. On top of that, both books are a kind of meditation on a place that Neil Gaiman wasn't from but would eventually call home. Gaiman's current home is in western Wisconsin. I suppose it's entirely possible that I prefer American Gods because I am an American, but I think there's more to it than that. In my opinion at least, the new and old gods of America are a more interesting, diverse, and historically grounded bunch than the characters and groups that are puns on London neighborhoods and underground stations. Besides that, the plotline and the characters of American Gods aren't so starkly good and evil. Plus, it takes up more space and time, and it uses both to its advantage. Then there's the difference between protagonists, and of the two, I definitely favor American Gods. Richard seems to be cast in the Arthur Dent mold. Arthur spends most of the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy being very upset and not fully understanding what's going on. And for the first half of Neverwhere, that's exactly how Richard behaves. It honestly got aggravating after a while that he would say or do something stupid because he would refuse to believe his own eyes or listen to what other people told him. Richard eventually learns his lesson by the second half of the book, but that's almost a shame because being a fish out of water was also his most memorable character trait. Shadow, the protagonist of American Gods, is a much more interesting character, at least from what I remember. Admittedly, he is very stoic, but he's much more sure of himself than Richard is. He's much more willing to try something new and engage with the supernatural situations around him, even when he doesn't fully believe in them. Also, Shadow has a complicated relationship with his ex-wife. He very quietly reveals the dark truth to the people of Lakeside, and unlike Richard, he plays a central role in resolving the climax at the end of the book. Still, there are some things that Neverwhere does that have no comparison to American Gods. The original idea for the story was for it to be about feuding clans of homeless Londoners, but Gaiman made it more fantastical because he didn't want to romanticize living on the street. Even so, while the characters are a step removed from homeless vagrants and the plot has nothing to do with class warfare, a very clear theme of this novel is that homeless people are still people. Anastasia came from a broken home in London above before the rat speakers took her in. Dor dresses in layers of found clothing. Richard constantly gives money to beggars, which may have been why he was able to see Dor in the first place. Just about all the characters squat in abandoned alleys, sewers, or Victorian ruins. And during the Blackfriars trial, Richard has to confront a version of himself who is mentally ill, homeless, dirty, and a complete wreck. By contrast, the villains include a pair of well-dressed thugs who enjoy getting their hands dirty but don't live in the dirt, and an apparently angelic being who promises the nominally homeless protagonists everything, delivers nothing, and then later on it turns out that he was only pretending to care for the sake of his own selfish personal agenda. So while I'd say that American Gods is a better overall novel, Neverwhere offers a unique setting with its own particular themes, so it's worth reading for that reason, if nothing else. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time when I look at a book about monosex humans.